Hey, this is John. Let's Talk Native is now on Patreon. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. We will be producing exclusive content for our Patreon supporters. Thanks for checking us out.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. We highlight the voices of Native activists, writers, poets, artists, thinkers, and musicians who are fighting for the rights of Indigenous people all over Turtle Island. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. In this moment of historical change and social justice, our voices matter now more than ever before. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Say hello and welcome to the program. I am John Kane and this is Let's Talk Native. Look, I've got to talk about something, a conflict that is really brewing, and not sure that it has a real smooth solution ahead of it yet. So let me explain. Look, several weeks ago on my New York show, Regan and I talked about the problems that the Mi'kmaq fishermen are facing up in Nova Scotia, and some of the racism that they're facing. And this is a follow-up on what we talked about then. So let me recap. The Mi'kmaq have had a Canadian Supreme Court ruling that acknowledged that they have that their rights, their treaty rights, are valid. Now, again, I want to be careful. The Supreme Court didn't give them rights. It acknowledges that they have the right to maintain their traditional fishing rights and to continue to fish freely to what they call in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. And I say that because that word moderate becomes a kind of a big sticking point. So this is a court ruling that goes back several decades. And it has become a point of contention because the Canadian Fisheries Ministry has attempted to regulate what commercial fishermen can and can't do, and so it leaves a separate set of rules or a lack of rules to apply towards Native fishermen, and this has caused a bunch of racial tensions. So the conflict that is going on today really became heightened almost a month ago. In September, around the 21st, around the 20th of September, the Mi'kmaq chiefs basically met with the fisheries minister after a bunch of white fishermen pulled up almost 400, 350, almost 400 lobster traps that were the property of Mi'kmaq fishermen. And they seized them. And, allegedly some of them were damaged as well. And the RCMP were there and actually just let them do it. They knew what they were doing and they just allowed it to happen. Now, the position that the white fishermen are taking is that these lobster traps are not supposed to be in the water because of the regulations that they have to abide by. But they're refusing to acknowledge that the Mi'kmaq have treaty protections, and they have rights that are laid out in treaties, recognized by the Canadian Supreme Court, and acknowledged by Ottawa and Prime Minister and the whole bit. But in this situation, because the RCMP just let them do it, that emboldened all these white fishermen to say, obviously what we're doing is okay, otherwise the police would have stopped us. So they became almost this vigilante force that they felt was validated by the inactivity of the RCMP and other law enforcement agents. So they just went about doing this. Now, the Nova Scotia Premier, who says that the province recognizes the treaty rights of the Mi'kmaq, although they say, but the nature and extent of those treaty rights is unclear. So even as they attempt to claim to recognize some of our distinction, some of the rights that we never gave up to Canada or the United States, but even as they attempt to do that, they make it, they muddle it by saying, yeah, we recognize your treaty rights, but we don't know what they are. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So that's back, and that was reported in the media on September 21st. On the 22nd, the Fisheries Minister Bernadette Jordan released a statement saying that the Mi'kmaq have a constitutionally protected treaty right. So again, not that it's a constitutional right, but their rights are protected by the Constitution to fish in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. So that comes out after they had these traps, and then ordered that these traps be released to them. Don't know to the extent that it actually happened, but that's what was ordered by the premier of. Even the Nova Scotia premier was saying the same thing. So then you get to this debate about why the non-native fishermen are saying they have to enforce these fishing regulations themselves. They're saying that that allowing the native people to catch lobster will screw up the whole ecosystem, and that it's going to, in the end, it's going to deplete the stock. But here's the thing. On September 25th, the Dalhousie University's Marine Affairs program said the contentious says that this whole idea that I got to try to get this word now right. The SEPEC, I know this was going to be tough. SEPEC Connecticut Mi'kmaq, that their fishery isn't likely to impact negatively the lobster stock. In fact, so this is a university whose area of study is marine life, it's who the fisheries go to for this information. They say that it's not likely to dent the lobster stock. They said it is not the environmental threat that it's being made out to be. So that's coming from a major university on the Canadian side whose job it is to review and analyze the fishing industry in Canada. So the claim by all these white guys that the native fishermen are going to screw up their lobster stock doesn't really hold any water amongst the experts in that field. So that's on September 25th. Now, as we get into later on into the month and then into October, one of the things that's what is clear is that the way the media keeps saying this thing is that this whole conflict is that the Canadian federal government is to blame for this whole conflict because they have not made clear that what these rights that are protected by treaty are. They won't even acknowledge that this is a racism issue, that racism is behind all of this conflict. Now, again, up to this point, it was merely the seizing of lobsters and the seizing of traps. But by the time you get into October, Now you've got a boat that was destroyed, and this is on October 5th. A lobster boat was destroyed by a suspicious fire, and it has taken. Nobody was arrested. There's a lot of debate on how much investigation went into this, and this is October 5th. Now we're getting later into the month here, and there still seems to be no effort to stop the actions that these white people are taking against native fishermen. So now we get into October 13th. On the evening of October 13th, a mob of between 100 and 200, all claiming to be fishermen, who knows if they really are, white fishermen, they went after what they call a lobster pound, which is a building where the caught lobsters are kept before they go to market. And they destroyed one of the vehicles. This was the Mi'kmaq's lobster pound. They went in, they destroyed a vehicle, burnt it, destroyed a van. They stole a bunch of the catch, and they were threatening. And here again, the RCMP were right there. The police were right there. And rather than the police turning back the mob, telling them what they're doing is unlawful, they were actually carrying the demands of this white mob to the few. There was only a couple of Mi'kmaq people that were inside the building saying, look, these are the conditions by which they're going to let you leave without being injured. I mean, they were literally negotiating for the mob. And of course, the native people inside are saying, no, we're trying to barricade. We're trying to protect our catch. We're trying to protect our lives. They were trying to barricade. And this is literally the situation getting completely out of control. And the RCMP. Now, I got to say at this point, to the extent that the RCMP has had clashes with the Mi'kmaq, they have literally sent snipers in camo fatigues to surround Mi'kmaq when the Mi'kmaq were trying to stop oil exploration or gas exploration. So it's not like the RCMP doesn't have the resources to be very assertive and very aggressive to stop something that they deem a threat. But in this situation, they literally were accommodating this angry mob of people who were there to basically assault these people and commit acts of violence, vandalism, theft, grand larceny, the whole bit. Instead, the RCMP just made it sound like it was beyond their control, like they were outnumbered. This is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police claiming that a mob of 100 to 200 white men were overwhelming them. And so rather than protecting the so-called rule of law or any of that stuff, they were protecting the rule of mob. I got to tell you, to me, this is democracy. And so all you who want to tout the wonderful attributes of democracy, when an angry mob can have their way not only with a marginalized people, but even supposedly have their way with law enforcement, this is your wonderful democracy that the U.S. and Canada tout as one of their hallmarks of their of their culture. All right. So we get in the next day on October 14th, Chief Michael Sack was assaulted. He was literally beat up and attacked by some of these white fishermen. Now, again, very little being done. Nothing. There seems to be no accountability, no reprisal, no consequence for the actions of these guys. In the meantime, they've got people that are getting all over the media. They're on television. They're on the CBC. They're on all of these international networks, claiming that they are simply trying to enforce the fishing regulations. But again, completely ignoring the fact that those regulations do not necessarily apply to people who've been fishing these waters, who have a history that predates colonization. So then on October 17th, this is just last Saturday, the lobster pound that was being attacked by this angry mob was burnt to the ground. And of course, between the day they attacked the pound on the 13th and then till the 17th, this angry mob had not only stolen, but they'd also killed, destroyed. They actually poured paint thinner and a few other things to destroy, not just kill the lobster, but torture them essentially, but also make it so that they couldn't be marketed. They just make them go to waste. It reminds me of that huge mound that you used to see in a photograph of all of the buffalo skulls that were stacked up because people were killing buffalo just as a means to harm the native people whose sustenance depended on that. This is tantamount to that. This is an angry mob of white people who are not being having any law enforced against them, that are basically having their way with a small group. And when I say small, again, I go back to this Dalhousie University's Marine Affairs program, who again attest that the small amount of lobster fishing that the Mi'kmaq would be involved in would not impact the lobster stock. It would not impact the environment. But these guys just feel like we can't allow them to make an income. And the debate it keeps going back and forth about what it means to say that their treaties say they have the right to pursue a moderate livelihood. Because this is kind of an interesting debate. Because white people want to decide what is acceptable for our moderate lifestyles. It reminds me a little bit, even on the U.S. side, there was a provision that they were trying to put into the tax code that said that that we could not be held taxable for certain tribal benefits as long as they weren't extravagant. So again, white people get to decide what is extravagant for us. What's an extravagant livelihood as opposed to a moderate livelihood? Because we can't let extravagance reach Native people. That is set aside for white people. So between this interpretation of a Mi'kmaq treaty or Native treaties in general, and the way tax law or whatever else is created, there's always this idea that we've got to keep Native people in check. So this word moderate, as it applies to the livelihood that the Canadian Constitution, these treaties, and all these other things are supposed to protect, it ends up being debatable on what is considered a moderate livelihood. Do these guys only have the right to fish for their own consumption? Or does livelihood mean something to sustain their families? Well, clearly it does. And so when you're going to have a situation where white people get to decide what is a moderate livelihood and by whose standards, because if they say, well, they're Native people, they don't need much. Yeah, for them, for those people, a moderate livelihood would be X, Y, and Z. We're not going to compare it to our major fishing industries and what white people need to maintain a moderate livelihood. No, they actually want to categorize what it is that is considered a moderate livelihood by putting us into a context. Well, they're Native people; they don't need much. So this ends up being the debate. And so when I see these stories that keep trying to say, well, the problem is the Canadian government is not clearing up what the treaties mean. Well, it isn't for the Canadian government to decide unilaterally what the treaties mean. It's actually up to us to decide, because these treaties aren't giving us rights. These treaties acknowledge that we have the rights. So by that definition, it isn't up to the Canadian federal government to say, okay, we're going to determine what we think. We're going to impose regulations that only allow you to have a moderate livelihood. We're not going to let you guys become, affluent. We're not going to let you guys have extravagant lifestyles. We're only going to let you have a moderate livelihood. And see, that's the debate. That's the debate that white people want to have. That's the debate that Canadians want to have as it relates to Native people in general, but certainly in this situation. It is amazing because what is rarely being talked about in any of the Canadian media or even on the U.S. side is the clear role that racism is playing here. This is a distinctly racist act that is happening, or acts that are happening against the Mi'kmaq here, and there's no other way to break it down. You can't be any more clear in the fact that you've got white people who are committing acts of violence in terms of assaults, in terms of arson, and then, of course, acts of vandalism. And all of this, by any definition, would be considered terrorism, because it's a whole idea of committing an act that not only affects the people you commit the act against, but the idea of committing an act that will put people in fear, that will create a change in behavior that goes beyond just the fishermen, but that Native people themselves will see what they are up against in terms of the violence, in terms of the arson, in terms of the theft, in terms of the property damage. And I mean, and again, I go back to one of the earlier disputes when the RCMP were literally giving the demands of the angry mob to the Mi'kmaq. They were saying, look, they're going to allow you to leave unharmed under the threat of violence and physical and possibly death. They were literally being told, if you leave, if you abandon all of your catch, all of your equipment, abandon, and the building wasn't even theirs, it was a lease building. But if you abandon this building, we're going to let you leave with your lives. If not, and literally the RCMP are not, other than trying to negotiate some time here, they are not charging anyone. Now, I will say, supposedly there is an arson investigation, and there may have been charges that have been filed for the arson of the destroying of the lobster pound, that was destroyed. But the crazy part is, that's probably going to be driven more by the fact that it was a non-native property that the arson was committed against, because it was only a leased building. Now, I will say, there are non-natives that are supporting these fishermen, and in fact, one of the things that did happen is not only was this angry mob going after the native fishermen, they were actually going after some of their customers. They were threatening them. There was mobs that were showing up at some of the buyers of the Mi'kmaq lobsters. There's an effort that is going, in many places where restaurants are saying, you know what, in solidarity with the Mi'kmaq, we're not going to serve. We're taking lobster off our menu. They're in a way that's a bit of a problem, because it ends up being like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because nobody wants the fishing industry to end. Certainly the Mi'kmaq don't. They just don't want this racism and these racist acts to continue. So all of this is happening. And while you've got Trudeau, and you've got the provincial officials, you've got even the police, you've got the fisheries minister, you've got all these people who are acknowledging, yeah, they do have a right to fish, but that isn't keeping at bay this angry mob, and the angry mob continues to grow. I don't know that we can honestly say that this angry mob of white people are just fishermen. As you look at what happens with this idea of white supremacy growing both on the U.S. and it's been there on the Canadian side. We've talked about that. If you ever want to go check out the video that Jake and I produced called "This is Canada," it shows just the high level of racism that exists on the Canadian side. I know generally, people throughout the world think, oh, Canada, it's so nice. Well, it isn't so nice. And what's happening right now with the Mi'kmaq is an example of the overt racism that not only exists amongst some of the white supremacists in the country, but how law enforcement is complicit with that racism, and complicit with that white supremacy, and complicit with all of these acts of terrorism that are being conducted against people who are really just trying to do what they have been doing for thousands of years. seeking a harvest out of the ocean. They've been catching lobster and feeding their families with it. And in fact, the commercial viability of these Mi'kmaq fishermen has essentially been eliminated by by either having their traps seized, destroyed, stolen, having their all of their inventory, all of their stock destroyed as it was stored in this lobster pound. But they've reduced their abilities to produce so significantly that all they've been able to do is catch enough lobsters for their own use, for their ceremonial use, and that kind of thing. And look, I know people don't envision what Native people, how much our traditional diets and how much some of our the lifestyles we developed, and how the sustainability of those lifestyles, how much they are part of our culture. But they are part of our culture. For these people, look, many of us don't have lobster as a normal part of our lifestyles. But that's not true for these people. The Mi'kmaq, this is part of their staple, their dietary staple. And to have that eliminated, not only as it relates to them having any commercial viability, but to even sustain themselves, it can't be more clear that what they're experiencing is overt racism, that and the actions that are intended to disrupt their lives, to drive them out of this business, to essentially not allow them to even compete. I understand what they're suggesting is that they have an unfair advantage. But you know what? Here's what nobody ever considers, and I've talked about this in other shows. We are always in a situation where we are not at a level playing field. Even if we have certain rights that were guaranteed in treaties, even when we have certain rights that maybe protect us from certain regulatory advantages or give us certain regulatory advantages, it still doesn't mean that we have reached a level playing field in terms of how we enter into an industry. Otherwise, there would be this burgeoning and tremendously large Native commercial enterprises that would have this this debilitating competition advantage over the white people, and that doesn't exist. And in fact, again, when universities study this, they say, look, there's no major impact going to be occur because of the few and the small scale Native fishing operations that are really there to sustain a lifestyle that goes back to their culture, that goes back thousands of years. That's what these Mi'kmaq fishermen are trying to do. They're trying to sustain and maintain something that has been a part of their culture since time immemorial. And this is what they're up against. They are up against this dramatic flare-up of white supremacy that's a part of Canadian culture. Look, we're going to take a break. When I come back, I want to talk about how this is being felt by other Native territories and what other Native territories are doing to support the Mi'kmaq. We'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Hey, let me give a shout out to my sponsors, to my supporters. I want to give a thanks to Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric Eric White in ERW Enterprises, and the folks at Grand River Enterprises, and all of you who from time to time make a contribution. I also want to remind people that we are on Patreon, and you can go to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native and become one of our Patreon members. And in doing so, we will provide our Patreon members some exclusive content. In fact, Jake and I are working on it as we speak, and we're going to provide some of that exclusive content to our Patreon subscribers. Patreon is a way that you can support the show and do it modestly. Do it something that will give us $5-10 a month that'll help us replace equipment, build out our equipment inventory, and allow us to do more. So there are any number of ways that you can support the program, and Patreon is one of them. So by all means, check out our Patreon site. Look, this circumstance that's happening with the Mi'kmaq is something that our people have experienced before. And among the issues that we've talked about here in the past has been the solidarity that Native people demonstrate when there's a conflict. And this, one of the places that was highlighted was the Gunazadage Oka crisis. And when our people were under siege over a white municipality trying to turn their 9-hole golf course into an 18-hole golf course on Mohawk lands, there were Native territories all over that supported our resistance. The Wet'suwet'en people on the West Coast stepped up. People in northern Canada stepped up. People in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq stepped up. And in fact, the Mi'kmaq sent several dozen people down to Gunazadage and to Ganawage as well during that crisis. So we've seen this demonstration, and as a result of the solidarity, we oftentimes feel not just an obligation but a responsibility to demonstrate solidarity when our friends in other Native territories are going through. So whether it was Standing Rock or back in January and February when the Wet'suwet'en were facing this pipeline that was being proposed through their territory, it was some of our people, the Mohawks in Tendenega and other places in Ganawage, that stopped railroad traffic and basically shut down the Canadian rail system in solidarity. So as this thing is happening now, with the Mi'kmaq in Gunazadage, or in Ganawage specifically, they launched a series of what are being called rolling blockades, where our people with vehicles are stopping traffic on some of the major thoroughfares that goes into Montreal. Keep in mind that in order to get into Montreal, you essentially, off of many of the major highways, you have to cross Mohawk territory, Ganawage in particular. And so when we do these rolling blockades, when we block the Pont Mercier Bridge, when we do some of these things, it has a tremendous impact on the lives of Canadian citizens. So we feel compelled, we feel a sense of responsibility when when our brothers face this kind of overt racism. And we know what it's like. When we revisit back to 1990, the impacts that our people in Ganawage felt, especially in Ganawage, from the racism, the burning effigies, the rock throwing, the assaults, all of this, the stuff that took place during the Gunazadage/Oka crisis. Our people knew what it was like to be on the receiving end of some of the most overt racism and white supremacy that anybody's ever experienced. I'm not, I don't want to get into what do they call it, the oppression Olympics, but there's almost this level of ignorance or a failure to acknowledge the racism that Native people experience, and we do experience it. I mean, it's demonstrated in ways that many other people don't necessarily see. Look, we understand violence. We understand when people are murdered, or if they're raped or assaulted, or when when their people are harassed in public spaces. But there's also other types of racism that Native people uniquely experience, and it's tied to some of the mischaracterization of history, whether it's, Columbus or mascots or all these other things. But at the end of the day, it always comes back to this idea that there is a sense that whatever Native people have to experience at the hands of white people is somehow justified. I've talked about this before. Many people, regardless of their political leanings, will acknowledge that the abuse of women is wrong. They'll acknowledge that slavery was unjust and that it was wrong. But today, there are still people in the U.S. and Canada who think that what Native people experienced was not only necessary, but that it was natural. And the idea that Native people can still be the subjects of this overt racism. That's why we have missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's why we have poverty levels on Native territories that exceed what any other people experience in the U.S. or Canada. Unemployment rates at the highest levels. This idea that what befalls Native people is okay, and that the policies that drive poverty, that drive assimilation, that tries to eliminate our distinction. Look, all of this fishing issue, that's exactly what this is. This is an attempt to eliminate whatever distinction we have, whether it's tied to our moderate livelihoods, or whether it's tied to our culture, tied to whatever our historical beliefs are tied to. They want to eliminate that. They say, no, you conform with Canada. You conform with Canadian law. No, you conform with U.S. law. There is still an effort to constantly assimilate us into their fabric, not to acknowledge our distinction, not to acknowledge that we have rights that predate white men being on the shores of our lands, white men fishing in our waters, hunting on our lands, taking our timber, occupying our land. We have rights not because you gave them to us, but because we predate your existence. Our culture predates your whatever culture you claim to have. Our systems of governance, our language, and our livelihoods, they predate yours. So there's nothing that you can do that comes in and says, okay, we're just going to take over your lives. Look, both the U.S. and Canada claim that the authority of their governments come from the consent of the governed. Well, that's fine, but we are not your governed. And I know this is tough, and frankly, on the Canadian side, oftentimes this is worse. In the U.S., I think people understand, at least many of the citizens understand, that we don't consider ourselves U.S. citizens. Now, I'm not saying all Native people take this position, but on the Canadian side, this is something that's more difficult. The act of assimilation has been, in many ways, much more aggressive. Even though there sometimes are things that accommodate the distinction of Native people, it is clear that both the Indian Reorganization Act on the U.S. side and the Indian Act of Canada both had the same design: to subjugate Native people under U.S. and Canadian law. And this is problematic because the idea of having a treaty with us acknowledges that we are distinct from you, that we are not a part of you. And in fact, I mean, one of the things that is noteworthy, even going back to 1990 and the Ganazadage-Oka crisis, the idea that Canada could actually use its military against the Mohawk people shows that they looked at us as a foreign force, as an outside threat. Most countries can't, U.S. and Canada, they can't use their military against their own people. The 1990 crisis clearly demonstrated that we are not Canadians, that we are not Americans, that we are a distinct people. And I realize that many Native people are indifferent about what that really means. And we get into a debate about voting and about census and about, are we Canadians? Are we Americans? No, there are still people who, without having to actually take that specific stance, live their entire lives by defining our distinction. And these lobster fishermen, these Mi'kmaq that are trying to maintain their cultural livelihood, these sustainable lives that have been a part of their culture for thousands of years, They aren't doing it to make a political stand. They aren't fishing lobster to be rich. They are trying to support their families. They're trying to do the same thing that all peoples all over the planet try to do. They try to sustain themselves. They try to support their families, raise their children. And they try to promote who they are, their distinction, their identities, their culture. This is what's under attack. This isn't just about attacking people pulling lobster out of the ocean. And it certainly isn't about protecting the environment or the ecosystem. None of that. This is about attacking distinction. This is where I always have to remind people that assimilation is still genocide. It is not a kinder or more or gentler genocide. It is genocide. And when I hear people put words in front of the word genocide, like, oh, you mean economic genocide, or you mean cultural genocide, or you mean, by putting those words in front of it, you're eliminating what genocide means. It means eliminating us as a distinct people. And any of these policies, even as they try to negotiate a settlement of this dispute, it's like, maybe we'll come to terms with what rules Canada will allow the Mi'kmaq to fish under. Instead of saying, look, we are concerned about environmental issues. We are concerned. Let's do some studies. And if you're fishing outside of what we consider the season is affecting the ecosystems, then we'll ask you to make recommendations on what you can. No, they're not doing that. They're saying, let's come up with some rules that Canada can impose on the Mi'kmaq that will, in all likelihood, affect not only their livelihoods, but their ways of life. This isn't about just livelihood. Is about money, right? It's about how you support your family. But lifestyles is a broader picture. It involves culture. It involves ceremony. It involves the history and relating to what you do today, how it relates to what the people who came before you did, and how you protect something going forward. So look, we oftentimes talk about 7 generations. And if the Mi'kmaq are not adequately supported here by other Native peoples, what stands to be lost is the future. This isn't about this year's catch. These guys will take time out of their livelihoods to fight for this. Why? Because it's about the future. It's about what their children will be able to do. It's going to be about how the stories that are a part of every aspect of their lives will not just be stories of the past, but they will be stories that will be teachable for the future. That's why maintaining our distinction, maintaining our identity is so important. Look, this isn't necessarily about insurrection. This isn't about revolution. And it sure as hell isn't because we're trying to take over a country or an industry or try to hurt anybody. This is about us maintaining our identity, maintaining our distinction against what many people think are oftentimes insurmountable odds. When 200 people show up at a building that only has 2 or 3 Native people inside, and a police force supporting and complicit with the angry mob, that sometimes can seem like an insurmountable force. But our people stand up to it. And they've stood up to it. Look, they've pushed back on the French. They've pushed back on the English, and we push back on the Canadians, and we push back on the Americans as they continuously try to eliminate us as distinct people. I know some people are going to try to reduce this thing down to the price of a lobster and whether somebody can buy a lobster out of season. But that's not what's at stake here. This is much bigger than this. And that's why today, even as the folks from where I'm from in Ganawage will continue to do these rolling blockades, I know they're meeting every day. They're meeting today as we speak right now. There are people all over talking about what they're going to do to support the Mi'kmaq here. In fact, again, Michael Sack said he's getting calls from all over Canada, all over Turtle Island, saying, "When do you want us to send men?" There are people offering to go there and to stand, not just stand with these guys, but to fight back. That's what Native people are saying. When do you want people there? And whether to Michael Sachs' credit or to his criticism, depending on how you want to view it, he's saying not yet. But what he said to the media, and he said it very clearly, if the Canadian government isn't going to fulfill its obligations and acknowledge our rights, if you're not going to, we're not asking for protection, against some invading force. We're asking for protection from you. If you're not prepared to hold your own people accountable, then we'll bring in the people that will. And there are people from all over quote unquote Indian countries, from native territories all over the US and Canada, who are saying, just say when, and we'll be there. And I got to tell you, this could turn into a much uglier event when our guys fight back than when they just take their burning boats and their burning vans and their stolen catch and their destroyed traps and their burnt buildings. When our people start saying, nope, we're not talking about justice here. We're talking about equity. Because the problem is, you think that you control what is and isn't justice. That's not justice to us. What we're looking for is equity. We're looking for what is even. I heard somebody ask the question, Regan and I the other day asked, at what point does justice cross in the line of vengeance and revenge? Well, that's a good question, because payback can sometimes feel more like equity. Payback can still, for us, can feel more like justice. But payback is what many people say, oh, that's revenge. Well, I don't know if it's revenge. All I know is that, look, even in the Christian culture, they talk about eye for an eye. And look, we're not trying to be vengeful. But if we don't push back, if somebody else's boat doesn't sink to the bottom of the harbor, then do they look at that as the right to continue to sink ours? Right back to day one, when all these mobs of white fishermen went out and started pulling up the lobster traps, they felt validated in doing that because the police let them. The police didn't try to stop them. They didn't warn them. They certainly didn't seize the traps that these guys were pulling up, and they knew they weren't theirs. They just allowed it to continue, and they became complicit in that. And the statements that came from those fishermen, the representatives from the fishermen said, look, we know we're doing right. You know how we knew we were doing right? Because the police watched us, and they let us do it. They wouldn't have let us do it if what we were doing was wrong. And you know what? It's because the police didn't think what they were doing was wrong. And that's the problem. The courts don't think what they were doing is wrong. Look, the Supreme Court may have ruled, and their Constitution may say, well, we got to acknowledge these treaty rights. But they purposefully leave it somewhat nebulous. So it ends up being a mob rule scenario. And the crazy part is, this is almost the definition of democracy. As long as the biggest groups get their way, that's considered democratic. I know people don't see it that way, right? They think, well, no, democracy means justice. No, it doesn't. Democracy means the majority gets to dictate to the minority. Well, look, after our populations have been significantly reduced because of genocide, because of crimes against humanity, our humanity, it's easy for white people to tout this idea of democracy now as they sit as the majority. Look, 53% of Americans are white. The population on the Canadian side that's white is significantly more. So we are not protected by democracy. And we aren't protected by the rule of law that is created by this white democracy. That's the problem. That's why I say justice isn't what we're after. We're looking for equity. We're looking for fairness. And we are willing to fight for that equity. We're going to fight for what is ours. And what is ours isn't the tangible things you think it is. What is ours is our right to exist as distinct people. We have a right to exist as a free and independent people. whether you think we do or not. And it's not something that you give to us or take from us. You can't take our freedom away. What happens is we either will continue to fight for that freedom or we will give up the fight. Or, this is the other thing that happens. Sometimes we live to fight another day. But don't think for a second that if you get over on us today, that doesn't mean our future generations aren't going to stand back up and fight. I oftentimes talk about Hawaii. Hawaii is a perfect example. The Hawaiian kingdom was stolen from the Hawaiian people by the United States. And for several generations, there wasn't much noise after that initial illegal occupation. But this generation of Hawaiians is finally saying, no, we know. We know what the truth is. We know what you did was illegal. And we aren't standing for it. We're fighting back. So look, you may have kept the Hawaiian people silent for a while. You may keep Native people silent for a while. You may put us back on our heels for a while. But it doesn't mean that we've ever consented to your authority. We have not consented to your rules of law. We have not consented to subjugation by the United States or Canada. That's what's playing out in Mi'kmaq territory right now. This is violence. This is genocide. Look, it may not be massacres. It may not be the intentional spread of disease that Europeans have used in the past. But it is still mobs of white people that are trying to assert their will over our people, over a people who have been marginalized by violence, by disease, by poverty, and by location. I mean, the small amounts of land, the small amounts of water, the small amounts of resources that we continue to try to tap in to support our people is still under attack. Whether it's fishing lobster, whether it's whether it's hunting, whether it's what we try to protect our land and our environment, this is under constant attack by the U.S., by Canada, by mobs of white people whether they are government officials or whether they are individuals just trying to profiteer off of our lands. Most of what Native people have experienced were not governmental actions. They were racist actions of a mob. And that's what our history is. And what happens with governments is governments try to justify it. Look, most of the lands that Native people have lost was lost through fraud committed by individuals, not by military campaigns, not by the government proclaiming that they own our lands. I know we can talk about doctrine of Christian discovery, but most of the lands that Native people lost was lost by individuals screwing our people, by individuals defaulting on leases, defaulting on purchases, defaulting on all kinds of all manner in which they would occupy our lands, committing fraud like the annexation of Hawaii. This is being done sometimes by government, but oftentimes by mobs of white people. And even if it's by an individual white person, it's that individual white person is protected by a mob. It's protected by the police. It's protected by the courts. It's protected by their politicians, by their government. But most of what we have experienced in the most overt forms of racism has been white individuals that have inflicted that upon us, either through the theft of our land, our resources, the murdering of our women, the stealing of our children. It's individuals who do it. But those individuals are protected. They are protected by racist governments. They are protected by colonialism. They are protected by their so-called rule of law. Well, I'll say it again. There is no place in history, and Canada can talk about the Indian Act, they can talk about this treaty, that treaty, and all these other Canadian laws they've passed or whatever else. U.S. can talk about the same thing, the Citizenship Act, the Reorganization Act. They can talk about their amendments to their constitutions, but we have never consented to be subjugated by the U.S. or Canada or any other European power. That's just the bottom line. And because we haven't consented that, we have not provided our consent to be governed by you. We may sometimes have to take a step back. On occasion, we have to live to fight another day, but that we will. So regardless of what happens with these few Mi'kmaq fishermen who are fighting for the right to their moderate livelihoods, we will continue this fight. We will continue the struggle, and we will step up in any way that we can, and we will do it at our time, in our time, not yours. So that's the way this thing is going to play out. But I got to tell you, we're going to keep on this. I'm going to see if I can get somebody representing the Mi'kmaq to join me on a future show. And I want to go through much of this again, but I want you to hear their perspective. I want you to hear how they view their future, not just how they view the past. That history gets rewritten by white people all the time. Our history is ours, but our future is ours as well. We will not have that future dictated to us without our consent. That's just the position that we take as Ongwe. I want to thank you for listening to the program and look forward to covering this story as it goes forward and as issues come before us. Thanks again. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.